In this video, we'll talk about constructors. Now, what are constructors? Now, look at this example here, which is of human. Now, when you talk about human, we have some variables, right? Of course, when you talk about these two variables, these are instance variable. And then we have seen in the image as well, basically, whenever you create an object, example in this, we are just creating one object. And that object is getting created inside the heap memory. You can see this is the object we got. And of course, with that object, we have assigned the value for the age, we have assigned the value for the name as well, which is ready, but I have not written it here. But we know that the object is created. Now, the thing is, when you create the object, if you observe the line number 29, on this line, when you create the object, what happens? When you create the object, in the heap memory, it will just create a blank object. Example, if I try to remove this, if I keep it empty, it will create an object with a value. So the value would be, it will have a variable which is age and the value will be 0. And it will have a variable called name and the value will be null, right? I will just try to print those things. What if I do is, I will just print the same statement before assigning the value, right? So I'm printing it here and I will comment this section. So that's how you comment, right? I don't want this line to be executed. And now if I go back here and compile and run, you can see we got null. Null basically is when you don't have the data assigned to object type. That's right, string is an object type. We'll discuss about string later in detail. As of now, just remember, by default, the value for string is null and the default value for integer is 0. Okay, that means if you don't assign these values, there will be default values. What I want here is, of course, there is a way you can assign the values later, but what if I want to assign the value when the object is created? That's right. On this line itself, I want to assign the value. That means the moment I get the object, I don't want to have a null value. I want to have some default values. Example, let's say by default, every object created, the name should be something else. The name should be, let's say, Babu or something else. I'm not sure. But can we have a default name? Can we have a default age? So let's say for my application, this application can be used only by those people who are 12 and above. So I can simply say, hey, the minimum age for this is 12. So by default, the value for the age should be 12. Can we do that? So how do we achieve that? Of course, we can assign the values here, or we can use something called a constructor. Now, how a constructor looks like? So a constructor looks like a method itself. Let me repeat, a constructor looks like a method itself. That means a constructor will have a name, a constructor will have the round brackets. Example, if we talk about methods here, we have a name and we have a round bracket. In the same way, for the constructor as well, we have to use that. So what I will do is I will say public. Now the only change is in the constructor, you don't specify the return type. Okay, so we can directly mention the constructor name here. But what should be my constructor name? Now there's a compulsion that your constructor name should be same as your class name. So what is my class name? It's human. And then since it looks like a method, we can give a round bracket and we can open and close the curly brackets. Now one thing I wanted to mention, you can see with the curly brackets are mentioned just, the opening brackets are just mentioned on the same line. And here the curly brackets are mentioned on the new line. Both works. Some people prefer to use on the same line. Some people prefer to use on next line. So anything works. Now in this constructor, I can assign the values. But at this point, let's not assign the value. I will just simply print the statement. I will say out. And here I will print in constructor. So you can see we are printing in constructor here. So that's our constructor. Okay, so let me repeat what is constructor. So constructor is a special method. That's right, because it looks like a method. It has the same name as a class name. So those are the rules you have to remember. The constructor will have the same name as a class name. A constructor never returns anything. So you don't have to mention int, float, or string, anything there. So just specify the access, which is public, and then mention the name, which is human. And in this, you can do whatever you want. Okay, so I'm just printing in constructor. So let me just try and compile. So compilation done, there is no problem. When I run this code, one thing to observe, nowhere, see, when you talk about these methods like get age or set age, all these methods, we have called them, right? So this is where you're calling them. Constructor, you can see we are not calling it, but still constructor will be called. Okay, so even if you don't call it, it will be called. Now, when it will be called, every time you create an object, it will call the constructor. So every time you create the object, it will call the constructor. Example, let's say if I create two objects, I will just copy this line and paste it here. Of course, I should have a different name for the reference, obj1. Now you can see we have two objects. Now when you say you have two objects, and if I try to compile and run this, you can see we got in constructor 2 times. So every time you create a new object, it will create a constructor, or it will call the constructor. Okay, if that makes sense, what we can do is, if we can remove this line and I can assign the values. I can say age is equal to 12 and name is equal to, let's say by default, John. Of course, you can have any name, but let's say John. Now, in this case, I can see if these values are assigned. What I can also do is I can just comment this section. Let's say I'm not assigning the values. Let's see what are the default values. Compile run. You can see we got John and 12. So by default, you assign this value. Okay, so this is where constructors are helpful. Now you might be thinking, hey, we can assign the values here itself, right? See, there's a idea, there's a standards which we follow. Whenever you want to perform any operation, always do that in a method. Don't openly do it in the statement like here. If you want to perform some operation like assignment or calculation, always do in the methods. And constructor is like method, right? So you can assign the values here. There's no harm in terms of compilation. You can assign the values here as well, but we have to follow standards, right? And also just try to think about something advanced. Let's say you are trying to connect with a database. Now in that scenario, your application is trying to connect with a database or the network. You need that connection, right? Now, where do you write the connection? You can write the connections in the constructor. And that's why this becomes very important. Now, if you remember, we have also talked about method overloading. So when you have two methods with the same name, but different parameters, those are called method overloading. Now, can we do that in constructor? That's tricky, right? So let's discuss that in the next video. How do we achieve constructor overloading?